If you know anything about Japanese swords, wakizashi, katana, tachi, you'll be familiar with this particular cross-sectional shape. But what you might not be aware of is that they also had double-edged blades. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, you'll be very familiar with either antique or replica examples. This is an antique from the Edo period of this particular cross-sectional shape that we find on Japanese swords. Sometimes it has a fuller, sometimes it doesn't, but this is called a shinogi zakuri. And this particular cross-sectional shape was the most popular and is most commonly found, most successful cross-sectional shape that you'll be familiar with from Japanese swords, be it wakizashi, katana, tachi, and so on and so forth. And particularly with this style of kisaki or point as well. And this particular setup, a single-edged blade with a back edge here with a ridge at the back, and there's actually a particularly tapering shape, was definitely the most successful, is the most prevalent cross-sectional shape that we find on Japanese swords. But it certainly wasn't the only one, and we find a variety of other types of cross-section and in fact kisaki shape, point shape on different Japanese blades. And we're going to look at one particular one here which isn't widely known. And here we have an absolutely beautiful replica example from Shadow Dancer Swords. I'll stick a link down below to them because they're making some beautiful things. And the first thing you'll notice is the first half of the blade, the fort as we'd call it in European swords, is like a typical shinogi zakuri blade. So it is back edged, it has a spine at the back and a single edge here. And it has a fuller bohi going halfway up and then ending very similar to a naginata. Okay, so this is sometimes known as naginata nayoshi, and that is, in other words, shaped like a naginata. And then it transitions into this double-edged point here. And this is a type of blade which is actually encountered quite early on in the sort of, should we call it, kind of samurai era in Japanese history. And so we're talking about back to the 8th or 9th century AD. But this cross-sectional style of blade and this transition from a single-edged blade to a double-edged blade, we actually encounter in later swords copying the earlier swords. So they literally look at the old swords and think, I want a blade like that, and they copy them. But we also, as I mentioned, we encounter it on naginata. Now, naginata tend to have a different kisaki or different point style to this, but nevertheless, there is an obvious parallel to be made and similarity between this transition, particularly with the shape there of the fuller or bohi, into this kind of tapered or double-edged blade here with the tapered back. Very, very similar transition on a naginata. And of course, naginata were widely used from the 13th, 14th century all the way through until the Edo period, 19th century. Now, this style of blade actually goes by various names, and in different books will give you different names for it and different advice. Different people may have been taught different names for it. But one name is the Kisaki Maroha Zakuri. Okay, so Kisaki refers to the point, Zakuri is the cross-section, I believe, but Maroha. So sometimes people just refer to these as a Maroha blade, and some people refer to these as a Kogarasu blade, or Kogarasu Zakuri, I think, blade. So they go by various different names, and I have also seen collectors refer to these simply, usually with a different tip than this actually, and I do have another example which we'll look at in a future video probably. But sometimes this general transition is referred to as naginata nayoshi, which means naginata-like. And we find that also not just on swords, but also on knives, particularly, you know, the tanto, the shorter blade. So this essentially is a blade which is at the base very similar to a typical shinogi zakuri blade, and then transitions into a double-edged blade. Now, it has been noted that this might possibly owe its kind of inception and its kind of idea to the ken, the sword which came before, the double-edged sword which we find in temples. Now, the double-edged sword was important in Buddhism particularly, but in temples they were often still made as votive offerings. And you'll notice sometimes there are carvings on the base of katana and tachi, for example, and sometimes tanto, that show a sword, and the sword is usually in the shape of a ken. a straight double-edged sword. So it could be, I don't know whether this is correct, and I don't think necessarily anybody knows for certain, but it could be that this is alluding to the Ken blade up here, but then the base of the blade downwards is like a typical Nihonto, which is a Japanese sword, be it a katana or a tachi. So it could be that it's combining the straight double-edged Ken with the straight single-edged, more typical Nihonto. Now, one of the reasons this is sometimes known as a Kogarasu Zukuri, which means the Kogarasu shape, should we say, or cross-section, is because it's named after a famous sword, which is the Kogarasu Maru. And the Kogarasu Maru was actually forged by a very famous swordsmith all the way back, allegedly, in the 8th century by a famous smith called Amakuni. And that's essentially a national treasure. And so some swords that were made in later centuries, 15th, 16th, 17th, all the way through to the 19th century, are literally copying that sword. And this is something I think people don't realise, is that the Japanese were sometimes prone to making swords in the style of earlier swords. So sometimes, for example, I have some antique swords behind me. You can actually find swords made in the 18th or 19th century that were made in the style of earlier 16th and 17th century, or even earlier, in this case, 8th, 9th century Nihonto. So a little bit like we find a similar thing in the Ottoman Empire, interestingly, that sometimes Ottoman officers in the 19th century were wearing Ottoman swords made in the style of the 16th century. And they're not exactly the same, but they believed they were in the style of. There are differences in ways we can date them and know which is which. But, so, very, very interesting blade shape. Now, I think a lot of people that have looked at these in the past, I know my friend Skal has done a video about these, and I will do a proper review of this Shadow Dancer replica here, but just spoiler alert, it's really nice. Probably the nicest replica Japanese sword that I've ever been sent. Extremely beautifully made. And a lot of people have tested these and made, you know, big things about the fact that it's got a false edge, and it's great because one of the big differences that we talk about Japanese swords, or at least typical Japanese swords, and European swords, or at least typical European swords, because obviously there's single-edged European swords as well, is that you don't usually have a false edge or a back edge on a Japanese sword. So this means you can do techniques like in longsword with this sword. And to an extent that's true. However, I think that one thing that gets overlooked is that probably wasn't the main reason why these were double-edged. It was probably for more symbolic reasons, because it's harking back to the ancient Ken, the straight double-edged sword, which essentially came from China originally, and also this particular, the Maru, this particular famous sword that a lot of people are like, I want to have a sword like that legendary sword. So in many cases, and possibly there was an element of wanting to look like you had an ancient sword, even if your sword had been made in the 16th century, or like, oh, but this, you know, this has been in the family since the 9th century. So there's all sorts of complicated social elements involved in these. It's not just practical, but could it be practical as well? Yes, you've got false edge cuts that you can't normally do with a Japanese sword. Yes, it makes it harder to grab or grapple them to some extent, and also probably more effective at thrusting against certain targets because you've got a double-edged spear point, kisaki, there. Anyway, that is a very brief introduction to this absolutely gorgeous style of Japanese blade that I think is not widely known. So there we go. I'm sure I will do more, and obviously there's going to be a review of this sword, and we're going to test it as well. We're going to cut some things. So thank you very much to Shadow Dancer for sending me this, and thank you very much for watching the video. See you again soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.